Are you in a band? Are you an entertainment entrepreneur? Are you a musician, songwriter, or producer? Or are you wanting to start a career in the music industry? If so, then this podcast is for you. On the Do That Music Thing podcast, we'll be interviewing subject matter experts, artists, and other leaders in the music industry to identify actionable strategies to move you forward in your career, spark some inspiration, and at the least just have some fun talking about music. So let's get to it and do that music thing. Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Do That Music Thing podcast, where we are chatting it up with music executives, songwriters, producers, anyone in the music industry making waves and making success for themselves. And today's guest is a really good friend of mine. He's an incredible vocalist, an incredible songwriter, and vocal producer. Let's give it up for Mike Cali. Mike, how you doing?
Chris, I'm doing well, and I am pumped to be here.
Awesome, man. Well, we're glad to have you. So you and I met co-writing, writing songs, and I believe we met through, was it Matt Friedman and the We Should Write Sometime application? Is that correct?
Yes, we did, which was a great past episode. You interviewed, just a quick shout out for people to listen to the episode with Kevin, the CEO of the We Should Write Sometime app. The Tinder for songwriters and music creators. And Chris and I guess, both swiped right on each other, WRITE, and set up some time and wrote with our good buddy, Matt Friedman. And we've written several since. We wrote with Shane Grove. Proud of that one. Drunk on Drinking. That's how we met.
That application is an incredible tool for songwriters, and Mike is correct. We did an episode with Kevin, the CEO and co-founder of the We Should Write Sometime application. If you are a songwriter, stop what you're doing right now, download that application. It's an incredible tool. But on today's episode, I really want to dig into your story, Mike, and how you have come to be a songwriter, how you've come to be a vocalist and a vocal producer. So take us back to the beginning and what got you hooked on music. Let's start there.
Yeah, definitely a roundabout journey. It was not a direct line. And I think along the way, there's things that I could have done better to save me time and beeline faster to making me a more happy, productive creator. As most of us creatives know, we need to be creating in order to be happy and in a good headspace. So yeah, really happy to be here to share to share my story and also some of the things that I think could help other people find their way faster to making and creating music in more of a flow state. And I grew up making up songs. Like when I was young and I was a kid, I was always making up silly things. They weren't complete verse choruses, but definitely would catch my brothers, cousins, neighbors singing things, little riddles and stuff that I would come up with. And I didn't really necessarily know that was songwriting because I grew up in New Jersey, far away from Nashville, and wasn't very familiar with the music business or that there was a possible path for a career in the music business. So my roundabout way towards music started as most kids do. I got the standard music education, always gravitated towards music in school. I played the trumpet. I did the school plays. I was convinced to join the show choir in middle school. And those were my earliest musical memories, right? And as a kid, I think kids always gravitate towards the things that they're complimented for. So I was always complimented for things musical. I grew up in a family of athletes. I have 3 younger brothers, and they're all great athletes. And I didn't necessarily, I could hold my own. I definitely held my own playing sports, but I definitely was more musically inclined. And, I stayed on the path of conventional education. I went to college, and it wasn't until I picked up the guitar around college age and did my first open mic that I really started to think, I'm on this path of getting a business education, but I'm learning this guitar thing and this songwriting thing is starting to uh, show its head, and I'm not really sure what that means. And I wasn't quite ready to, I wasn't quite ready or refined, or brave enough, I should say, to say, hey, I'm going to go be a songwriter, because I still didn't know what that path was in Nashville. Um, so I graduated, moved out to Pittsburgh. Music always remained a part of my life, and always remained something outside of my 9 to 5 job that I pursued. It's what made me happy. I had I worked for about 10 years in corporate retail, is where I found myself working after getting a business degree. Nights and weekends, I would find myself playing at weddings. Um, I would find myself playing at the local venues, wineries around Pittsburgh. And it really, the 9 to 5 job was really weighing on me. And I'm someone, I think, like a lot of creatives can probably relate with, that wants to be their own boss. And with the hours that I spent 9 to 5, I decided that I wanted to start my own company. Of course, as the millennial I am, I felt like I can do it better, or had an idea worth exploring. So I started Nights and Weekends, developing this idea for a startup, and I convinced one of my brothers to join me on that journey. And we raised some money, and did some stuff that I'm very proud of, and we can save that for another podcast. But what we did was create a website for local boutique shopping, and that was around 2019. And I spent about 2 years building that before we hit really the middle of the pandemic. And it was during the pandemic that it became clear that working with the small businesses that we were working with, the timing was not right. And timing is everything, especially in music, but also in business. And so just as my startup was winding down, fortuitously, the universe works in crazy ways. But I had applied to be on a television show, because I really wanted to pursue my love, my passion, which is music. And I got the opportunity to go out to LA and to sing on a pretty wild and crazy television show called I Can See Your Voice, and got to be on their pilot episode of that show. And I think, looking backwards now, that was 2 years ago. It really was a pivotal moment of my life, because it really gave me the validation that I needed in order to declare myself a music maker and a songwriter, and to kind of step out into the public and build a network around music, something that I hadn't really had never done before. And it really happened at a really important time for me, because with the startup, with the failure of my startup, um, something that I had put my all into, I was very down, and I was really sad. And I found myself kind of retreating to music, something that I knew that I always wanted to make. I tell people that doing the startup was like pushing a large weight up a large mountain. And for a long time, that could be very, very difficult. But then when it came to music, it almost like I was pushing the ball down the mountain, which really made no sense to me, because I kind of hid. I hid from the music because I don't know what it was. I was afraid to declare that that was my thing, that was something that I wanted to pursue, because we know so many people that want to pursue it, and not everyone can make it. And that's the reality of it. But that doesn't mean that, what I discovered is that that isn't going to stop me from going and creating and being my best version of myself. So the blessing that the show in LA was, allowed me to kind of step forward more publicly as a musician, as a music creator. It really was a wonderful experience. I can't wait to tell my grandkids about. And which I'm single, by the way, so I'm not really on the way to getting. So we got to work on that. But
one thing at a time. One thing at a time.
One thing at a time. One thing at a time. Yeah, it's really the pandemic actually was a tremendous blessing, in a way, for such the terrible time that it was. It gave me the opportunity to learn more, specifically about producing music, something that I had always be interested in. and something that I know would become very important over the last 2 years of my life, as I really tried to add value to the songwrites um, that I have.
Well, I think the pandemic for a lot of creatives gave us some time to think and kind of reassess what we found important. I had a child at the beginning of the pandemic,
Wow.
which, in my perspective, kind of was I had this time to think, but then I had something heavy behind that thought. Well, where what I mean by that is now I have two people looking up to me and watching me. And that made me really think, wow, do I want to spend my life doing this, or do I want to show my kids what can be done? And with that time in the pandemic, I really sat and thought a lot like, wow, because my journey is very different, but also very the same. I come from a musical family. Both my parents were musicians, and I got bit by the bug early. So I was in my first band when I was 14 years old, recorded my first EP when I was just turned 15, and was kind of like off to the races. I thought by the time I was a senior in high school that I was going to be in a huge rock band and things were going to be this certain way. It didn't happen that way. I went to college, made it through college, and then I started touring again. So I had like a little bump, and then I made it through 3 years of school and started touring immediately with rock bands, and then kind of fell into country music after that. But then I hit another bump, and I started a corporate career and really didn't think about it until the pandemic hit. I'd always kind of sang and wrote songs and that sort of thing, but that pandemic hit, and I had nothing to do but and think about my place in the world and really, what am I good at? What am I passionate about? And where do those things kind of overlap? Where does that value overlap? And it just hit me. I think it was maybe 3 weeks in, 4 weeks into my second daughter being born. And it was like, well, I'm getting back into music. And I think within maybe 6 weeks, I had written and recorded, finished a rock EP. That kind of got me back out there. And then I started co-writing again. And all of these things started to snowball. You said it really well. It was like pushing a mountain or pushing a rock downhill or pushing that weight downhill. And it just started to collect and get bigger and more exciting. And all of a sudden I'm getting co-writes and I'm getting movie placements. And I'm like, this is insane. But a lot of it came from consistency, where I didn't get pulled in a lot of different directions. I just kind of kept doing the same things. Like I kind of assessed, okay, I can write songs, but I can also demo. I can also produce music. And that's like it's my value add when I go into co-writes, I feel like. And everyone kind of has their own different value adds, especially in the co-writing space and in the music space. What would you say, how important is that personal value add in your opinion?
It's a great question. You tapped on a lot of things there. First of all, your kids as your motivation is such a beautiful thing. I just want to acknowledge that. Um, it's really important. Um, but in terms of the value add, um, I think when I was on the onset of discovering the power of co-writing, I was realizing and learning about, because up into the point of say 2020, I had never really co-written before, and I was unaware of the 1 + 1 = 3 effect, and I didn't really understand about uh, the way it worked in the industry, that most songs had multiple songwriters on it. And it was at that time when I began co-writing and understanding how important relationships are and how important bringing value into the room when you're writing is, and the tremendous spectrum of values that I didn't even realize were really involved, right? Um, but in terms of my own value that I'm bringing to the table, um, first and foremost, I try to be cool, and what I mean by that is like I just not to take myself or anyone else so seriously in the act of creation because everyone needs to feel comfortable when they're creating. Um, so I think that's straight up value. But if we talk like real tactically, I'm much more of a melody guy than I am a lyricist. Although I've been working out the lyricist muscle and becoming much more adept at it, thanks to um, writing with people that are more talented than me. And I think that's very important to try and get yourself into rooms with people that are more talented than you. And I specifically use that word choice of more talented and not more credentialed because I think that's often a misconception for new writers is they think if they can get in the room with a hit writer, they're going to write a hit song. And that's really, from my experience, not really the way it works. It's a very relationship driven process in terms of the output. I find that it's much easier to write a song I'm proud of with people that I genuinely enjoy spending time with. And I think that goes to deal with the vibe in the room. Just like any relationship or friendship, you kind of start finishing each other's sentences or kind of understand someone's strengths and someone's weaknesses. Um, Good co-writers, I feel like fit together like puzzle pieces. One person's good at melody, the other person's better at lyrics, or vice versa. Um, so to answer your question, directly, I think I'm much more of a melodic guy than I am a lyricist. I also really thrive from I'll call it pre-production in terms of song concepts. So the guys that I write well with, I'll just give us a title and an angle, right? And then they'll start coming up with phrases, and then it kind of marries itself well with my kind of melodic ability. So I start really high up and then I go down low, and I'm a pretty good editor, which is kind of funny because I'm like good at the very beginning and the very end of the process. Is And you know what I've learned in sessions, to kind of hold myself back a bit. And this has happened with sessions with us, Chris. I remember writing with Shane Grove, and I forget who it was. One of you put this idea out, and it didn't make sense to me right away. The old me would have went into editing mode and went right after it and offered a suggestion or a way to change it. But now I'm kind of holding myself back a couple more seconds and realizing, oh, okay, he was a little bit quicker. That was a good idea. And so instead of inhibiting the creative mode of the room, the creative energy of the room with an editing comment, to kind of slow it down a little bit. And that's something that works for me and maybe could work for one of your listeners. But I also began touching on something that I definitely wanted to bring up. And I think another value to bring to a songwriting room, a co-writing room, is energy. And it's such an undervalued thing. It's the vibe. The vibe is everything, especially in the kind of music that we make, rock, pop, country. Setting that tone and giving your fellow creatives the encouragement that they need, I think is something so intangible and so valuable. Really, I was really lucky to have a mentor early on that taught me this, even before I knew I wanted to be a songwriter. He was a producer. This is my buddy Tony, who was he was actually we lived together. We were roommates in Pittsburgh, and I got to kind of come into close contact with his music sessions that he was doing. He's a producer. He works in the pop world, and he is so gifted. He's the kind of guy you just want to be around because you know something good's going to happen. And I think to some extent that's a natural gift, but I think partially it's learned. And it comes down really to the golden rule of treating others the way you want to be treated, and like kind of encouraging positivity and showing some energy and kind of breaking out. Like when I get excited in a write, and you'll probably say this, Chris, like you might be able to vouch for me. I'll show it. I'll be like, oh, that's sick. That's awesome. Like showing that encouragement is like so important for the room. And it's so important for that final product, because I know that when I'm encouraged like that, like if and it's got to be genuine. You know what I mean? If you're not feeling it, don't show it. But if you're feeling it, let it show. And that's really going to get you the best song possible out of the room.
The vibe is everything. I mean,
Really
you
is.
hit the nail on the head. And if we digress for 20 minutes in a writing session talking about something else, I know you and I get kind of like geeked out on production notes, and Shane is like, well, whatever, like, but we have fun. We
Yeah,
let it evolve. And
for
I
sure.
think it's so important to let it evolve. It is songwriting is a conversation, co-writing is a conversation between people. And when you're in a really good conversation, it never stays in the lines.
No, it's
And
so
that's
true.
how you write good songs, is that Drunk on Drinking is a great example how that session, we wrote that song in, I don't know, maybe 3.5 hours, 4 hours. But the conversation itself, topic wise, just went all over the place.
Hmm.
But the final product was awesome.
Yeah.
And it would not have happened without those off topic conversations, without that really positive vibe.
Hmm.
There's another episode where I think it's Todd and myself, or maybe Bradley and myself. We have a conversation about like the rule of the good hang. And you can talk to people that are in touring acts, and it's really evident in touring acts, but it's also evident in the songwriting community. People would rather create music with someone who is a good person and a good hang rather than someone who is super, super talented. Air quotes talented. Um, because it's a lot easier to have a relationship and connect with someone who is the good hang.
Yeah.
And it just helps, you know?
It from experience, yes, absolutely. I really do think we're taking this conversation down a path of um, kind of what makes co-writing work, and I love that we're going there. And it's kind of bringing to like to mind some other ideas and things that I know have helped me. Um, Not that I'm quite where I want to be in my career yet, but I feel like I've definitely learned some things through making mistakes that I would love to share with some other people. And I think one of the things we started to touch upon were the value, where was bring this kind of concept of bringing value to your to your co-writers. And I think that comes in a multitude of ways that weren't very apparent to me when I first started. And um, one of the ways that I think one of the best ways to contribute is by coming to the right with something to offer, and not just showing up to a right expecting greatness or inspiration to strike, which I think is the mentality of some beginning songwriters, and frankly of how I used to think it worked. Right, you would just show up to a right and you would just be divinely inspired, and sometimes that happens. But in terms of creating, a prolific body of work, which I think is what we're all out for. It's really doing your homework prior to the right, that moves the right along and in the right direction, and in turn generates more relationships with people because you're giving them a positive experience. It's very much a soft. It's very much a service oriented business, songwriting. Now that we're talking it out loud, because you're there to serve the room, right, and you're there to share value with the other people around the table, or I should say over Zoom, which is how I've been co-writing. I haven't had too many in-person writes, candidly, um, but really, in terms of offering value to the room, coming to the session prepared, if you're a producer, with a couple tracks that are going to get your writers inspired, coming to the table with some melodies, even if you don't have lyrics yet. But what I've found from my personal experience is really that a concept and a title, or an angle for that title, is really what gets the co-write moving fastest in the best direction possible. If you can show up to a writer, somebody shows up to a write with the concept, with the title, and the angle for that title, it really moves it along quickly.
Absolutely. One thing that I've always done, and this is pretty basic, I think, for songwriters. So if you're not doing this, I highly recommend it. But have a little hook book. You
Yeah.
have those little sayings that come to your head. I use Google Docs on my phone. I'm highly digital. I have all my devices connected. And I do that because it's the most, in my opinion, it's one of the most efficient ways to really get a final product.
Yes.
One thing that I focus on is, I've got my hook book, right? But then the document right next to it is the finished lyrics section. So when we're done with a lyric or a melody or, whatever, that's, I'll write it out, put it in the finished section. Then when I'm in the production mode, I will have made notes in that finished time, because I know that when we write, because I do produce demos, I kind of keep that in mind. I'm like, oh, it'd be really, really cool to do an under melody here with a cello, or it'd be really cool to do just like a stomp clap section here with a kick tambo or something. And I keep those notes, even when we're doing the co-write. That way, when I get to produce, when I get to work on the track, I've got all of it there. It's all set to go. Little time is wasted. And I think that's one thing that helps me and makes me feel more productive. Now, some people don't have the need for that, but anyway, get a hook book, write down anything that comes to mind, and even if you think it sounds like crap now, it might not sound like crap in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. I have used lyrics, I think, that are probably 20 plus years old in a song that I've written in the last 3 months, because it didn't feel good then. It didn't feel like it worked, but it worked now.
Organization is key, right? It's all about making most efficient use of your time. That means the time that you put in 10, 15, 20 years ago, whatever it was still laddering up to your goal of finishing that song, right? And I think organization is absolutely key from a songwriting perspective. Something that I didn't consider until after I ran my startup. When I came out of startup mode, I was in organizational mode, and it was really important for me to have an Excel document that had the date of my co-write, the co-writers, who wrote, what the title was there a work tape completed, where did we leave off, and this is all really important stuff, and we can dive down that rabbit hole too, Chris, in terms of keeping track of all that stuff for split sheets and that sort of administrative part of the game. But I think just as a starting point, it's a great idea just to chronicle to keep track within like an Excel document of what songs you're writing and when and who you wrote them with, and maybe even some keywords about the songs, because as you accumulate your songs, and you're approaching artists, and an artist is looking for a certain vibe, you can quickly find songs that meet those keywords, which is just a little hack right there.
Oh, absolutely. 1,000%. It's funny you mentioned that, because I have put that into practice in the last 6 months, adding the tags specifically.
Heck yeah.
If you are an out of town writer, out of town meaning Nashville writer, I think it's incredibly important to stay connected, right? So you join, the We Should Write Sometime apps, join NSAI. If you're not a member, I think it's a great resource. They have local chapters, but there are also things like Music Row magazine. They have an area, kind of like a members area, called Rowfax. And Rowfax posts all of the upcoming productions that are in need of songs. Now, the majority of them are major label, which means they do not accept unsolicited material or outside writers. However, there is a pretty significant chunk of projects at the bottom where independent artists need songs, and they give little descriptions, they give little tags, and it's become incredibly helpful to look at this Rowfax sheet of upcoming projects where songs are needed, have my Excel spreadsheet right there, on next to it, and I can just search and meet tags and then send the emails. Another thing that I think is incredibly helpful for songwriters is to get a song space or a SoundCloud. Song space is typically, it's a little more industry friendly, and you can track and you can input lyrics, and you can input writers and publishers and splits as well. And they have a free introductory, I believe it's 50 songs, but it's a really great tool to send songs to potential artists that want to cut or send download links to your other writers. But I would highly recommend being organized. And, Mike, coming out of that entrepreneurial mindset, it's incredibly helpful. And I think that people have this concept of artists where we're absent minded and we are just in the clouds consistently, while not entirely wrong. But I think when you approach it from a business mindset, it can be incredibly productive and really, especially if you're working a day job like a lot of us are, you have a few hours in the morning, a few hours in the evening. Make the most of them. And one way to make the most of them is to be organized and be productive.
So true. Anytime I've rubbed elbows with anyone with success in the industry, although their persona might come across as absent-minded, these people are the highest functioning, most organized chess players you'll ever meet, right? And what I mean by that is that it's one thing to be an artist who creates, but if you're out here trying to get people to get as many ears on your songs as possible, it's definitely going to be important to be organized. I'll just leave it at that.
Well, let's shift topics a little bit from songwriting, if it's okay, and let's talk about vocal production. This is a thing a lot of people don't know about, and I think it's becoming more and more evident, especially with the democratization of recording studios and access to recording equipment. But let's talk about vocal production. Explain to our listeners what that is and how are you involved in that?
Yeah, vocal production, I'd say, is one of the most underrated parts of putting together a master track. And vocal production, from the listener's point of view, in my opinion, is how genuine or believable is that artist on the track. And vocal delivery has a lot to do with the way in which a vocal performance is delivered. From personal experience, this actually, and I'm so flattered that you would bring this up, Chris, because from my experience, delivering a vocal wasn't always my natural ability. In fact, by a mentor, it was defined as a weakness many years ago, and it was only until he was nice enough to identify it as my weakness to where I could focus on it and get better at it, and nowadays even help other artists with their vocal delivery by producing their vocal. Tactically, what does it look like to produce a vocal, right? And ideally, a vocal producer is in the room with an artist when they record their vocal. And something that a vocal producer is going to do is going to coach that artist, first and foremost, making them feel comfortable and allowing them to perform at their highest level. But while delivering a vocal, coaching the artist in terms of timing, in terms of pitch, and in terms of the emotion and emotion is by far the most, because as we all know, the most famous vocalists aren't the best singers. And it's like, why is that? Well, there's many reasons, but something that I see, the reason why the best vocalists are the best vocalists is because they know how to deliver emotion. And to some extent, it's a gift, but to a great extent, it's a learned thing. And it's the way in which a singer is often called a recording artist. And what that means is that they're just like an acrobat would fly through the sky and like an actor would be acting and using their body, a vocalist, a true recording artist, knows how to use their voice as like a paintbrush, like they're painting emotion. And so by producing a vocal, when I produce a vocal, I love being there in the room with the artist and helping them use their voice as a paintbrush to the greatest ability that they can. And that has to deal with, like I said, timing, pitch, but also emotion. And then there's also the part in post-production, where an artist, where that happens. This is kind of the boring part where the artist goes home, kind of a thing, and that's when you sit down at the computer at your DAW, might be Logic or Pro Tools, and there's certain editing techniques that can be learned to auto tune. We've all heard of auto tune. It's used on everyone's voices. It shouldn't be taken as a negative insult or anything to anyone. But we've all been trained. Our ears have been trained over the last couple of decades to expect a kind of more polished vocal performance. So the last parts of producing the vocal are nudging in time and pitch to really get the effect that delivers what the artist's vision is. So that's pretty much the summary of vocal production.
It's an incredible part of the entire production piece because it's the diamond. It is the star of the production. It's what says, assuming you're doing vocal based music. Clearly, if you're doing instrumental music, you could take the same approach to a guitar line if you're a solo guitarist or a harpist. Same concepts would still apply. I'm a classically trained vocalist, and you really, really, really focus on the emotion, and that's where it should be focused. Think of all the incredible vocalists that you've ever heard of. You could almost have them mumble words, but if they were delivering it in the way they were delivering it, you wouldn't care. Like the Adeles, the Amy Winehouses, the Chris Stapletons, the Aretha Franklins, the Ray Charles, the Otis Reddings. Those are emotional deliveries, and they could just be saying ooh and ah, and you would still probably feel the same way. So, to all the singers out there, don't let that emotional aspect of your recording, don't let it go. It's so important.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the voice in most modern music, right? And the stuff we're trying to create here is the most prominent thing in the mix. It's the loudest track out of all of them. And it's certainly something that we is going to be standing out most to the listener, and is our greatest opportunity to connect with the listener, right? And I think all those artists that you just rattled off, they all have great arrangements, and they have great melodies, but I think a huge underrated part of what makes their music timeless is their ability to connect vocally. Like if you muted the tracks and you just listen to their vocal delivery, which I've done to, like, you could hear Michael Jackson tracks online, and like Freddie Mercury is another great example. You can listen to his isolated tracks, which I highly recommend any vocalist to go and listen to. You would want to listen to their voice, just by itself, because it makes you feel something. And it's like really asking yourself, like, what do they do differently than most people? And yeah, yeah, I think vocal delivery is king, in my opinion, in terms of production.
One of the best pieces of advice that I received from a vocal coach, Judy Rodman. She's incredible. If you are a vocalist out there and want someone that can really coach you in all aspects, I highly recommend Judy Rodman. I had an audition coming up, and it had been a while since I had vocalized. And within 10 minutes of our meeting, she's like, okay, you can sing your scale. You've got the right, like, don't worry about technique. You're fine. Let's just focus on your delivery, because it's clear that you haven't emotionally connected with an audience. And I was like, it's been a while. And she recommended that close your eyes. Think about the song that you're singing and who you are singing this song to. Imagine you are trying to convey this to someone that you know, and how would you look doing it? And after I did this 4 or 5 times, it became really natural. It was like, granted, it was a very intense conversation with this other person that clearly wasn't there. It's in my imagination, but it slowly became comfortable, like I was singing at this person. And then she said, okay, now open your eyes and just now do it. And it kind of became muscle memory.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's something that I think most new up and coming artists don't really consider as part of the process. But it's one of those things that once you have someone work with you on it, it's like you'll never look back and ignore that portion of the process ever again, um, because it's so important to the actual authenticity and genuineness that's conveyed after you have someone who's coaching you through a vocal. And it's very difficult to produce your own vocal. I'm not sure whether you find this when you're doing your own production, and creating demos. Um, and I've spent way too long listening to my voice. And that's also something that almost stopped me actually from making music, was that I never really liked the sound of my voice. And it is what it is. And I mentioned before that I was, and I'm proud to say, like, I've performed on national television. I've gotten that validation. But even still, like, I don't like listening to my voice. And so it's a very difficult thing to do. So to get someone else, someone else's perspective, on your voice and coaching you through it is just a remarkable, it pays dividends. It's
Producing
very useful.
producing your own vocals, it's hard. There's just no way around it. It's taken me 20 years to get comfortable with the sound of my voice. Even now, I hear it in the headphones as we're talking, and it still kind of makes me cringe. So, but it does. It's taken me 20 years, and it's taken work with a lot of other people and listening to coaches and listening to producers and the insight that they have, and writing it down and remembering it when I perform these vocals in front of a microphone. A lot of us too, I think, really, us being vocalists,
Mm-hmm.
I think really have a hard time getting out of our own inspiration. And when I say that, I grew up listening to grunge, listening to Alice in Chains, listening to Stone Temple Pilots, Chris Cornell, early 90s rock. That is the standard in my mind. So if I don't sound like Chris Cornell, I don't think I sound good enough. Now that is absolutely insane.
It
But
is.
it's taken me 20 years to, like, no, I have my own tone. I have my own way of singing, and the way that I sing is good for the way that I do it. But it's taken a lot of work to get to that point.
We can all relate to that, and I'm speaking for the audience too here. And I think at some point we have to part ways with that artist or artists that made us want to do this in the first place, and then we can come back to them, right? We can come back to them. For me, it was John Mayer, and I think for a lot of people that grew up, around this time, like, look to John Mayer as the standard in guitar playing. The standard is the way his voice is able to sit on a track. Um, and the funny thing is, if you ask John Mayer, he probably would tell you his greatest insecurity was his voice. So that's really the grand irony of it. But yeah, I was obsessed with John Mayer, right? And his writing and his ability to just be crafty with lyrics and, say things in ways that I hadn't heard before. And I literally had to say, like, okay, John Mayer, I love you very much. I need to put you over here for now, and I need to go discover Dylan. I need to go figure out what's going on in the country world, which is where, like, I've been for a while. And that's how I found traditional country storytelling and fell in love with that. And I actually went and fell back in love with Bryan Adams and Bruce Hornsby, hugely inspired by 80s type stuff. But Don Henley. But yeah, I think we can all relate to comparing ourselves as artists to the person who inspired us. And if we don't sound like them, it's like we're not cut out for this thing. And that's not true. That's a fallacy.
Kind of a personal preference question, though. Who are your favorite vocalists? Say, who are your top 5 favorite vocalists across all genres?
You're watching something happen in real time, me think of this, because I don't think I've thought of this, but here's who comes to mind. And it has a lot to do with um, who I grew up listening to. James Taylor, I would have to say, is probably number one. Um, has a lot to do with just how I was introduced to music from my dad. Um, so he comes to mind. I mentioned Don Henley, of the Eagles, and then he also had, I think a lot of people, it's an underrated album, "End of the Innocence." I think that's what the album is called, which was from like the late '80s. is one of my favorite albums, and End of the Innocence is probably one of my favorite songs. Um, but so I'd say number one, James Taylor. Number two, Don Henley. Um, three, I'd have to say, oh, you know who I'm really impressed with? I really like a lot is Shay Mooney from Dan and Shay. I think he's a very talented vocalist. Um, oh, I mean, this could go all over the place. I mean, you mentioned Otis Redding before. I mean, like, how am I supposed to? Um, Donny Hathaway. I mean, I'm just gonna start saying people who come to mind when I think of their vocals. Adele. Um, the expanse is just so vast. Like I'm having trouble. But those are some people who come to mind. I would say James Taylor, Don Henley, Shay Mooney. um, I like Bryan Adams. Huge fan of him, especially of the acoustic unplugged album. And you got to throw Adele in there. She definitely makes you feel something. When you hear, we talked about delivering a vocal and mastering the emotional delivery portion of it. I feel like she's the queen. She definitely does it.
Her voice on those songs, I see. I group her in with Amy Winehouse. Adele and Amy Winehouse are two vocalists that, given the song, I mean, I'll just bawl. I'll cry. They hit so hard. Not even necessarily the subject matter. I might get like an idea of what that song is about, but that delivery just gets me, just hits me right in the soul.
Yeah.
James Taylor, that's an interesting one because I don't feel like James Taylor most people think of when they think of vocalist. I think when people think of James Taylor, they think of songwriter. They think of storyteller, but not vocalist. That's interesting.
Yeah, he's excuse me. I had to go instinctually who came to mind as someone who's really memorable to me in terms of their vocal delivery. I don't think James Taylor has your traditional crooner voice, and I think I relate to it because I see myself as not having a traditional type of a voice. Yet he's still been able to weasel his way into America's songbook and writing all of these memorable classics, these classic songs he was able to deliver um, that have stayed with us for so long. And I think that's why he comes to mind. And I think that's why uh, that's why Don Henley comes to mind too. Um, these are people who I retreat to when I think about emotional delivery, I would say.
Don Henley. See, my I wasn't an Eagles fan
Hmm.
until I really started till my wife got me into the Eagles. Her dad is a huge Eagles guy, and I never really got into him. And I was like, "Wait a minute, I thought that's a Joe Walsh song." And they're like, "No, that's an Eagles track." I'm like, "Is it though?" So I'm a Joe Walsh guy, coming from a mother who was very into mid 70s rock, where the first records that I had were ZZ Top, Skinner, Bad Company, Queen,
Hmm.
James Gang. So I was like, the Eagles just never really hit me that hard until I started getting into that like back catalog and getting really into, um, you know, Don Henley's vocal delivery. Um, but him and James Taylor, you talk about just beautiful, not over the top, just perfectly there.
Yeah, yeah. That's where I see James Taylor. That's where I see James Taylor. And even after I said it, I kind of realized I was like, I don't think most people consider him, for his vocal delivery. But to me, he's done the job and has been memorable. Um, I mean, who I didn't mention is Chris Stapleton. That's who didn't come to mind right away. But now that we're thinking about it, um, he in my book is king right now. Um, I just went back in my YouTube archives and pulled up a I'm not sure what album it was off of his. It might just be just something he performed once, and it was a song called What Are You Listening To? I don't remember it being on any of his albums, um, but the delivery of that, holy smokes! It's a highly recommend. It's just him and the acoustic guitar, and it's a song called "What Are You Listening To." It'll come up real quick for anyone that YouTubes it.
Well, on the topic of Chris Stapleton and an emotional vocal delivery, the song, I believe it's called "Daddy Doesn't Pray Anymore,"
Oh yeah, that's
off of Traveler.
yeah, yep,
I mean, he just takes you on an emotional roller coaster. The first time I heard it, I cried. I didn't have that experience. I don't
yeah.
I couldn't really relate to that specific story per se, but I could relate to those emotions, and that one hit me hard. But it's because of his vocal delivery and the dynamics of his vocal delivery. He had the ability to start off really focused, really quiet, and then just builds every verse, every chorus, just a little bit more. So once again, vocal production, right? You know, you don't have those ideas.
Right.
You need to find someone who can provide them.
Yeah, I first saw Chris Stapleton in 2015. I heard his song by the band he was in called the Steel Drivers. I think it's like was called "Where Rainbows Never Die" or something like that. Heard that at a bar, looked him up immediately, saw he was coming through Pittsburgh, which is where I was living at the time. Couldn't find anyone to go to the concert with me. So of course I show up by myself because I have to see this guy in person. And there's barely anyone there. He was opening for Warren Haynes, from the Allman Brothers. I felt bad for Warren Haynes. I was like, wow, this guy is the real deal. I was listening to it was Chris Stapleton, his wife, and then he had his bassist and the drummer that I had seen like on YouTube prior. It was a pretty cool experience, but I digress.
You know, I saw Chris Stapleton open for Guns N' Roses.
Wow.
In Nissan Stadium in Nashville in front of like 70,000 people or whatever it was. And I'm a huge Guns N' Roses fan. So I was like, yeah, I don't care who's opening. I didn't know who was opening when I bought the ticket, I think. I just, Guns N' Roses.
You got a surprise.
Did I? Because I was a fan of Chris Stapleton. I was like, really? That's an odd choice, but I know that Axl is picking the opening acts and it's a different one typically every show. And I was just like, man, I mean, I love Chris Stapleton, so it'll be good regardless, but I didn't know how good that was going to be because his wife, he's on guitar, drummer, and bass player. And that's it.
Mm-hmm. Simple.
No crazy light show, just him. And I always tell this story. There was what essentially was a biker gang in front of me. I mean, these guys, 6'4", 6'5", bald, beards, jacked, huge. You would think that they would be of the machismo, of the very, masculine mindset, you would think, or you could make that assumption. As soon as they sang their version of "You Are My Sunshine," those guys were crying. All of them were just pouring tears. And that is the power of a wonderful vocal delivery.
It's a beautiful thing. I've seen that rendition on the NPR Tiny Desk concert. I think him and his wife did, and it really is a pretty delivery. But you're reminding me of another vocal delivery master who comes to mind. Another intimate setting that I saw him play in. I'm not sure whether you know Amos Lee. He is really phenomenal. Just his delivery comes to mind now too. How could I not have thought of him when you asked me about my top 5? There'll be names popping up in my head all week now. Thanks, Chris. I'll be like texting you. I'll be like, can we put this back in the podcast, please?
I'll get a text from you at like 3 a.m.
Chris, we got to get back on and record the top 5.
Oh man,
that's fun.
But yeah. Okay. Well, what else haven't we touched on? What else do you want to touch on?
Well, I think we talked about a little out of order. I felt like, but I feel like we covered some of the importance of bringing value into the writing room. And uh, a great resource that would be remiss to not give a shout out to about learning how to produce. And this was essential for me during quarantine, as I had that time to learn a new skill set to bring into the writing room, which for me was production. Um, it's called Music City Playbook, and there is a guy by the name of Forrest Glenn Whitehead who has done some really amazing things in his career down in Nashville. He had a couple Kelsey Ballerini early number ones, and he's put together, in my opinion, the most comprehensive professional resource for anyone trying to make pop country music out of their home studio. And I recommend his stuff highly. I put it right up there with the We Should Write Some Time app that we spoke about before, that's used to connect with other creators. But if you're looking to learn how to produce from your bedroom, Forrest Glenn Whitehead and his Music City Playbook, which can be found on YouTube, and he has his own website. Just a tremendous resource that I learned so much from, and just from that content, I just feel more confident bringing in loops that I've made into writes that we write to, and being able to quickly turn around a demo post write. It's just it's really cool.
One thing I want to add to that is I think a lot of songwriters who especially want to move into production, because it seems nice and it is nice to be able to demo material that you write. Don't let what you feel is a lack of resources slow you down. You probably have access to a lot more than you think you do. For example, your iPhone. Your iPhone has GarageBand on it. You would be surprised how good the vocal quality or microphone quality is on an iPhone. Case in point, go listen to my band's first EP, Revival. Those tracks were stereo exports from a writing day that I had years ago. It is a stereo export. So there's a guitar on the left, guitar on the right, and we are all in the same room live. I didn't do anything to it because I couldn't do anything to it. I dropped that stereo track into my iPhone. I took my iPhone earbuds and recorded vocals on the way to work every morning and on the way home from work every evening. Did it all on my iPhone. Now, granted, I took all of those vocal tracks and that stereo track, threw it on, I guess it was my desktop version of GarageBand, and mixed it, but that's the record. And I didn't pay for that DAW. I didn't pay for that stuff. That was already included on things that I already had. But taking that mindset and really kind of looking around what you have, and really, that is a surprising source of creativity. You know, I saw a really cool quote, and I'm not sure who it was from, or a concept from a producer on TikTok. And he said, one thing that he misses about being locked in a studio with no internet connection is all we had is what we had. So we had to get really creative, you know, bussing tracks down, putting mics in weird places that made really special music. Now we have access to everything immediately, and it's real easy to spend a month finding the right snare sample where you didn't have that luxury. But don't think that the constraint of resources is a bad thing. Think of it as almost a good thing. Let it stretch your creative muscles and find some new things and create some new things that way.
It's so true. It's absolutely so true. And to what you said before about keeping a hookbook, I do that in my iPhone. I also just go around and start recording random noises around in my daily life with my iPhone, and we'll use that in a track. It could be over Christmas time. I recorded the of the train going around the Christmas tree, and that's like a hi-hat, right? Or like firewood cracking in my backyard. I'll take that and use that as ambient white noise that you'll put under like a chorus part. You know, to some extent, we all do have the same tools. So it's like you want to think about how you can use them in a different way, right, than other people. But you're so right about when you walk into Guitar Center, it's like there's just so much gear and so many things we don't have. It's like the industry is so overwhelming. But really, at the end of the day, you know, we're talking like you just talked about. Chris Stapleton's up there with himself, a drummer, a bassist, and a harmony vocalist, right? And it's like this music can be the simplest thing in the world if you just let it be. Um, and Yeah, that's so true. Um, and you shouldn't spend too long EQing a snare sound, as I've done before. That's another great tip. Is don't spend hours EQing one snare sound so that it sounds the way you. It's probably the wrong sound. You probably just need a new sample, and you should download Splice and just find it 1, 2, 3.
You know,
there's a. I just saved someone 3 hours for just there.
you did it. You did it right there. Listen, people. You know, that makes me think of a really interesting concept too around modern music distribution and almost thinking of music as content. And I know I can feel the eye rolls from some people like, but that is love it, hate it. That's just the way that music is being consumed right now. It's being consumed as content or an addition to content.
Right.
When people, and we can talk more about this too, um, don't hoard your songs. If you're, I mean, unless of course you're writing for an artist, that's a very different type of songwriting relationship. But if you're writing songs for yourself, record them, release them, and move on. And I do know a lot of people disagree with me on this. And Mike, you might to some extent, because we haven't really talked about this before, but I am such an advocate for write your music, record it, get it to where it feels comfortable, and then release it. Or, you know what, if you don't feel comfortable with it and you realize you're spinning your wheels, kind of like I might be doing on Drunk on Drinking, that maybe I just need to release it. But those songs aren't going to do anyone any good, including yourself, if they just sit on your hard drive and no one hears them.
It's I'm a huge offender of that, right? And I think it comes down to a question of goal setting and what is the goal that you're trying to accomplish. For me personally, right now, um, my goal is to have a famous person, right? Someone that has a yeah, I'll just say it, just a famous person who's recorded hit songs, records something that I've written, and that's my near term goal. Um, and in doing that, I'm trying to build a catalog, and in building that catalog, I my goal is to sign a publishing deal, so where I'm able to focus on music, being a music creator full time. That's my near term goal. Um, and I think that there is a somewhat of a question from people like me. What songs do I share with the public and which songs do I not share with the public? And I think to a great extent, um, I do think that putting songs out is better than not. I'll just say that. Especially where I am at in my trajectory, I should be sharing more to build that brand, to make more relationships. When I say build that brand, meaning like attracting other talent to collaborate with. So I have more of those collisions with people to make 1 + 1 = 3 kind of a thing, if that makes sense. Um, but yeah, I think a lot of people, Chris, I think struggle with that, knowing what to put out there and what not to put out there.
I mean, let me be clear. I struggle with that. So I totally get it.
Yeah.
That is a near term goal for me to try and get over that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, you know, I'm also a big believer in the fact that I have not written my best song yet, and I will never get to that point. And the reason I say that is, well, if I release this song, so and so won't get to cut it. I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, well, if you wrote that song specifically for Tim McGraw, put it away and, you know, pitch it to his people, get to know his people. But all those other songs, you know, release good songs, write good songs. You are never going to have your best song. And am I saying that the right way?
I
Like you know I'm getting at, Mike. Like you're
I've been
never
very
ever okay.
we're all thinking it, right?
Yeah.
We're all thinking that we just wrote the one that's going to change our lives. I'm not going to put it on Instagram because I'm storing it away, right? And it's speaking this out loud with you. It's like you need to take that step onto the next lily pad, and then the next lily pad and the next lily pad, and maybe that song that you're trying to get out there is for the eighth lily pad down the road that you won't get to unless you put that first lily pad down. And maybe that song is actually your first lily pad. And that's kind of a lot of what songwriting is, right? Like coming up with something you're proud of, but then beating it and then challenging it and coming up with something better. And like it's all about the rewrite, you know what I mean? Kind of a thing. And it's having that like kind of faith. It's having faith that you're going to outdo yourself every time. If you just leave yourself open to whatever, whatever I call it God, whatever force you think that the creativity comes from, it's just being open to that and being trusting that you will come up with something better, better, and better each time that you write. And that's a scary thing. That's a scary thing to do. Definitely, I've held songs, I'm embarrassed to say, for years. You know, I've had a song that I was working on. I'd perform it still, and it still wasn't done in my mind, And then it wasn't until I got mentors, I got people who were able to coach me and help me understand if you want to be in the music business, it's about quantity and it's about taking reps and getting better and finishing songs just to get to the next song. And it was a total mind shift switch. And I understand some people will be turned off to that, and that's totally fine if you want to have that baby of a song and just keep refining and keep refining. But if if you don't look up, like time is just going to pass, right? And it's like your goals aren't going to actualize, and it's about just it's about quantity, right? Can you relate to that, Chris?
Oh,
Just
absolutely. It's
yeah,
look at it from a business perspective. It is the music business.
right.
So, what is a publisher going to be more attracted to?
Hmm.
The person who spent 10 days and every single day rewriting one song, or the person who had 10 songs?
Hmm.
Now, you can make an argument that, well, if that first one is an absolute banger, yeah, but quantity.
Yeah,
You probably got a little bit better every single song. And I'm using 10 days as like an arbitrary number. It could be 10 months. But you're going to be getting better because you have completed that song and you're on to the next one. You're going to do things. It's just like anything else when you are in a sport. You know, basketball. How do you get better at free throws? You do
take
more
free
free
throws,
throws.
a lot of them.
You don't sit at the free throw line and think about shooting the ball. Or I mean you could visualize it, sure, but you don't think about it 20 times. You do it.
Yeah, it's muscle memory. It's
Totally.
muscle memory. And success. What do they say? Success is when practice meets opportunity. And it's like if you can get all of these reps, and what I'm calling a rep is a full song rate, right? Get a network, get yourself in a room with other creators, come up with a song from scratch, turn that blank paper into something, a song you're proud of. If you can just keep repeating that process over and over again, then when you're actually put into an opportunity with someone that could potentially amplify that song, right? Like with when you're in the room finally with the artist that you're looking to create with, you've taken that free throw so many times, and you it's just muscle memory, right? Uh, yeah, yeah. So I think we can both agree that quantity is very important in songwriting, and that sharing is more effective than not for someone, especially early on in their songwriting career.
Totally. No, don't let the word quantity square you. Don't let the word quantity scare you or make you believe that it's more important than quality. The act of the quantity will provide more quality.
Yeah.
And One of the biggest things that took me a long time to realize, you're going to write crappy songs. The majority of them are going to be crappy, or parts of them are going to be crappy. So I think if you go into it knowing that you're not going to hit a home run every time, you're going to hit a home run every 150 times. And that's okay. And I think understanding that, A, is going to make you a better writer, but B, it's going to remove a ton of weight off of your creative shoulders and maybe even free you up to be more creative.
I can definitely resonate with that. And not to speak out of two sides of my mouth here, but I'm kind of something we touched on before is like kind of the secret sauce to knowing that you have a good odds of writing a good song is when, in my opinion, is when you have the good title, you have the concept and the title and the angle on the title. You have your little song map together, which is like what you're gonna say in the first verse, very brief sentence, chorus, very brief sentence. You can describe the song in 3 sentences. Then I know it's worth attacking the song. And it's almost like these days, like over the last couple of years, I've written a couple hundred songs, and I'm understanding and getting to the point where I know it's only worth writing the song if I have that solid song map. And what I'm referencing to, by the way, is another great songwriting resource. I actually have the book right here. I'm not being paid to say this, but it's the Marty Dodson and Clay Mills book series, which I thought was really, really good. They have how to master co-writing. Yeah, they talk about having a song map where you can easily describe each section of the song in a brief 6 words or less. It's tight. But where I'm going with this is that I'm finding that I used to write a lot more than I did, and I was writing songs in a more aimless way and coming up with quote unquote bad songs that aren't great at all. But there's a hack, I think, if you're able to come up with the song concept, the title, and the angle of that title first, then it's worth the pursuit of writing that full song. And then you start to learn a little bit more about your creative flow of like when you're hot and when you're not. And you kind of know when to write and when to focus on maybe production or focus on networking or focus on, it's a huge time saver. And you start to really compartmentalize your time like that. Yeah. And I think it's really important. And this isn't that I would say isn't something that I would have done when I first started writing. It was like, and I was following what some mentors and friends were telling me to do, which is just write. Just write. It might not even be a full song. It might not even be, just keep writing. And you just get better with imagery and different writing. You get better at telling a story. But then I think once you get to the point where you realize that how important that unique title, especially if you're writing the quote unquote music business, you realize how important having that unique title, the concept, and the angle of that title is something that's fresh, something that hasn't really been said before. And I find myself really going deep on those types of concepts. And it's a huge time saver, especially if you're trying to spend time building out a network. If you have a 9-to-5 job currently, so that's kind of like what I've been trying to do lately.
You have an interesting way of approaching it, especially through, I've never heard of that before, the song map.
Oh,
And that's really, really cool.
I can't take credit for it. That's all the Songtown guys, Marty Dodson and Clay Mills.
Oh, totally. Yeah. But I've never heard of that before, and I'm going to try that. And
it's helpful.
yeah, what I'm getting at is that there isn't one way to approach this. There's millions of ways to approach this. When I'm writing a song, I don't touch melody. I don't touch lyrics first. This is when I'm writing for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I do a guitar riff, and I build a track. So like, I have a guitar riff, and I'm like, okay, this is clearly like an intro lick. And then it takes me to a verse, takes me to a chorus, takes me to a bridge, and I build out the track. So I just play it to a click track in my DAW. and then I build out the song. I do all the instrumentation first.
Hmm.
Now, I do it to a grid, and it because of my background in production, it's really easy for me to like remove things and add things. I do keep everything, so like in a different playlist, I'll keep a different take of a guitar track, or if there's an acoustic track that maybe didn't feel right, I'll mute it, but I'll leave it, and then I export it, and then I listen to it, and I'll listen to it for sometimes weeks, sometimes years, and then all of a sudden, something will come to me. The song will kind of describe itself. It will tell its story to me. No, that sounds really abstract and out there,
No,
but
it
that's
makes
what
sense
it.
to me. It definitely makes sense to me.
But
Yeah.
that's maybe not the most efficient way, but that's kind of how it works for me when I'm writing for myself. It's why I enjoy co-writing, because it kind of gets me out of that space. But what I'm trying to get across is that there's 1,000 different ways to do this.
Oh, totally. I totally agree with you. And I do try to be mindful. And I do find it's helpful when other people are mindful when they don't try to just jump into their own process in the beginning of a write. And it's more or less like, so how do you like to start this? Right? Like how, you ask the other person to see uh how what their process is like. And if they're uncertain, um I throw out my idea of, hey, let's start with the concept first, because, like I said, that's just where I tend to have more of the success at the end of the day.
One thing I do with co-writes that I found to be really productive, someone just immediately approaches me and they're like, "Hey, so you got any cool ideas?" I was like, "Yeah, let's see what I got." And the ideas I throw out are typically from that hook book, where like, "Oh, well, here's a little riff I was playing, and I'll sing that hook on top of it, or I'll sing that verse, those two lines that I may have written, or a whole chorus, and we'll just see what resonates between the two or three of us. We'll just how does this feel?" And I can always tell, like, "Oh yeah, that." I'm like, "All right, cool, that's it." And that's how that kind of starts.
Yeah, lots of head nods over here. It's always like, which idea is making us most hungry to write? Like which idea, and you try to like keep an eye on those intangibles. Like, does someone really seem into it, or is it like, oh, maybe I'll write this, in a different write, or that kind of a thing. As long as it was your idea, I try to be very upfront with those things. Like, hey guys, I'm feeling really excited about this idea. If we don't write it today, I just want to let you know I'm going to be ready to. I'm going to write it in a different in a different write. Which is like a selling tactic, I guess. But
That was great. I'm pretty sure you did that on our first write, and I was like, "Oh, that's cool." No, no, but here we are.
yeah, true, true. Yeah, this has been a blast for real.
Okay, well, here coming up, this is my favorite part of the show. This is my favorite part of the Do That Music Thing podcast, where I get to ask the guest, what are three actionable items that you would provide someone, in your case, a songwriter, or a vocal producer or a singer? What three things would you tell them to do today that can move them closer to their goal and move them closer to success?
So the first thing I would say is not to treat songs so preciously. And speaking from personal experience, I've hung on to songs for years, and because I thought that it just wasn't done. And it's really important to get a song to a collaborator, a mentor, as quickly as possible to seek feedback so that you can get the song to its best place and then move on to the next one, because quantity, like we talked about, is so important in terms of refining yourself as a writer, setting up those lily pads to get yourself to the next song. So yeah, I would say the first thing is don't treat songs so preciously. Have faith and know that you're going to come up with something better. I would say is the number one. The second thing is focus on understanding where you can add value for your co-writes, and what that is really to help you build relationships with other people and other writers and get yourself known within your network for doing something and doing it really well. In my case, it might be vocal production, it might be melody writing, but really understanding where you can add value and coming prepared to the write with that value. Maybe you're really good at coming up with song concepts and you keep a hook book like Chris talked about. And so yes, coming prepared to writes, I would say, is the number 2 thing out of 3. And then the third thing is kind of a general, it's very cliche, but often hard to forget, I think, as we're trying to pitch and place songs with artists, is not to forget to write and create what you enjoy to listen to, what moves you. Because ultimately, like we talked about, it's songwriting and the music business is the business. The music business is tough, and you're going to be down and you're going to want to give up. But when you're invested in making something you're passionate about, it makes those really down times a little bit easier to get through. And if you're making something that you believe in, you have a much better chance of that thing connecting with someone else, which is ultimately what we're trying to do, right? Is connect people and connect with people through our art. So the third thing is really focusing on something that moves you.
Mike, incredible insight, incredible actionable items. It's a pleasure as always getting to chat. Love getting just to talk music with you. So thank you so much for coming on the Do That Music Thing podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It's not often that we get to say these things out loud as creators, and it's definitely helpful to synthesize and talk it out with a friend. So Chris, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Do That Music Thing podcast. To learn more about me, the host, Christopher Foust, you can catch me online at christopherfoust.com, on Instagram at chrisfaustmusic, or on Twitter at chrisjamesgtr. If you'd like to be a guest on the Do That Music Thing podcast, please feel free to email me at chrisfaustmusic@gmail.com. If you're a fan of the show, head on over and leave us a 5-star review. Thanks for listening. I'm Chris Foust. Let's go do that music thing.